Bigotry is not a mental illness, monsters do not exist, and y'all need to stop. So, this video is gonna be just a tad more serious than usual for me because I'm tired. Just constantly in general, but especially of this. This being people who call anyone who's done a violent crime a psycho, or bigots mentally ill, or corrupt and unjust politicians monsters. First, let's establish that I understand rage and pain towards bigotry, injustice, and atrocities of all kinds, and I get that not everyone's going to be able to take a step back and consider what they're saying before they've said it, but that is really not an excuse. This isn't a new problem, we're just seeing a lot more of it, more publicly, because people are talking a lot more vocally about people in positions of power who abuse that power. Regardless, it's something we should avoid in talking about these things. For example, let's take a totally imaginary situation that's not at all happening in the world right now and we don't live in a hellscape. There's this dictator, right? He's ruling over his land with cruelty and violence, violating people's freedoms left and right. Millions of people are dead because of him, and he shows no remorse. He argues this is right, and he has successfully convinced a large part of his country's population that actually, yeah, the deaths of so many of our fellow human beings is fine. Is he absolutely, without a doubt, one of the worst people in the world? Yes. Does he deserve to face justice? Abso-fucking-lutely. As does anyone who enabled and protected him. Is he a monster? No. He's a person. I need you to understand that when I say person here, that is a completely neutral descriptor. For some reason, some people seem to ascribe this standard of morality to personhood, as if, at a certain level of doing heinous things, people stop being people. This, in my view, is both incorrect and damaging to the conversation. Someone does not have to be good to be a person, they just have to be alive and sapient. They don't even necessarily have to be human. I'm personally halfway convinced that both octopuses and some corvids could either already classify as people, or are well on their way in that direction. Not to mention gorillas. This man in our hypothetical scenario is just as human as you or I, and we cannot afford to forget that. Just as we should not dehumanize minorities because it will lead to violence against them, we cannot afford to dehumanize the worst among us because it creates this false idea that that person is or was an outlier. An anomaly. Not human. Not one of us. This kind of attitude is the thing that leads directly to attitudes like, my best friend was accused of rape. Well, that can't be right. Rapists are monsters, and my best friend is not a monster. Which leads further into survivors and victims not being believed. It also leads to this idea that we would definitely know if we met a monster on the street. Like, we would know. We'd definitely be able to tell because they're a monster, right? There's no way a monster could just blend into the crowd because they're not one of us. They can't be our friends or family or anyone we know or care about because all those people are human. Even though there are dozens of famous serial killers whose stories directly contradict this. Not to mention, beyond being plain inaccurate, this attitude only furthers stigmatization of people who appear outside the norm. Another insidious thing about this is it bleeds into another bad habit people have, which is to point at bigots and say, they're not right in the head, or something to that effect. Because it creates this string of logic which starts with the separate ideas of this bigot is a monster, and this bigot must be mentally ill because no normal person would think or act like this, and ends up right back at enforcing the idea that mentally ill people are monsters. So let's look at this idea that bigotry is a mental illness. This is just plain wrong, and does nothing but hurt and further stigmatize an already heavily stigmatized minority. I'm not saying there are no racists or homophobes or any other kind of bigot who are also mentally ill out there. I'm sure there are. I'm just saying that being bigoted isn't the defining factor, because bigotry is not a mental illness. It's not something that can be managed with pills and therapy or a stay in the psych ward. It is a systemic problem, it is learned behavior, it is prejudices passed down from parent to child, or through the concentrated efforts of radicalizing groups. And while we're here, this idea of a psychiatric hospital as some place you can just chuck everyone you hate and never have to think about them again is not great, and comes from a long history of truly horrific practices that were used mostly on women and people of color when they got too uppity. Because no one who's saying a bigot of any variety needs to find their nearest psychiatric hospital is actually saying, I want you to get better and think this is the best path for that. What they want is to take this person they rightfully do not like and find a tiny padded cell and a straitjacket and lock them up forever and throw away the key. Which is not what psychiatric hospitals are, or should be. Another thing which this attitude does is it gives this impression to people who aren't mentally ill that they can't be bigoted because they're normal. I'm not saying it's as straightforward as having a conscious train of thought that goes word for word, I don't have a mental illness, therefore I can't be bigoted. But the more we equate bigoted actions with mental illness, the more that perception will start to worm its way into people's subconscious. A kind of, I can't have any bigoted misconceptions, and certainly don't ever do anything bigoted because I'm normal. Which again is not great because, and I will say this as many times as it takes for it to stick, bigotry is not a mental illness. It's not an illness of any kind, save perhaps as an analogy. The only way to fix it is to confront it in others and in yourself, and make the conscious choice to educate yourself and unlearn what society has taught you. Which, ironically, could actually be done in therapy, but the fact that it is something you could conceivably work through with a therapist does not a mental illness make. In fact, I'm of the firm opinion that many people, including those who are mentally healthy by our standards, would benefit greatly from seeing a therapist every now and then. Bigotry is not a mental illness, it is learned behavior. Anyone is capable of it. Literally any human being. Your favorite aunt, your sibling, your partner, your parents, your children, your friends, it does not matter. They're not immune to being terrible people, or even just kinda shitty, just because you care about them. My intention with this video is not to scare you or make you doubt those closest to you. It's to highlight that, in our natural discomfort with the worst in our society, we tend to try to put distance between us and them. It's only natural. You don't want to think that someone you love could be bigoted, because to find that out, even if they're not bigoted towards you specifically, will on some way feel like a betrayal. It will hurt, and you're allowed to be hurt by it. But ignoring it won't make reality any less real, and in the long run it won't make the hurt go away. We don't want to think about the fact that all of the worst people ever to walk this planet were just as human as anyone else, because that's kind of a terrifying thought. Because if the worst of us are just human, that means there's nothing fundamentally different about us, is there? You could take it that way, I guess. I choose to see it a little differently. If the worst among us are just human, that means there are no monsters to defeat. All we have to do is find and nurture goodness and kindness wherever we can, and perhaps that can truly make a difference. And I know that's not exactly easy, and it's not going to happen overnight. There's systems of power in place that need to be fundamentally changed, and so on and so forth. But the point is, all of it, every single wrong in the world right now, it was all built by humans. Which means we can change it. It's going to take a ton of work, and honestly, I sometimes doubt we'll ever manage to do it, because there are so many terrible people in such massive positions of power and with so much wealth in the world. But at the end of the day, there's no dragon guarding the castle, there's no ogre under the bridge. Just human beings who seem to have forgotten that they're supposed to share this planet with the rest of us, and keep it in some kind of shape so we can all keep living on it, ideally for thousands of years to come. Thanks for watching this video. As I already said, a bit more of a serious one, but I've had this script knocking around in my drafts forever, debating about whether or not I should even make it. In the end, I finally think I got my thoughts out concisely enough to be understood. If you liked this video, feel free to like it and maybe subscribe. I will be back here Thursday after next. Bye.